Hello and welcome everybody to the Click podcast. This week we have a very interesting guest with us. Today we have Dr. Matt Barney. Dr. Matt Barney is an organizational psychologist and a serial entrepreneur. His career spans over 25 years. He has worked in a lot of multinational organizations like AT&T, Motorola, Merck, Infosys, just to name a few, and he has been involved in a lot of interdisciplinary science and technology, resulting in 4 patents, 10 books, 43 peer reviewed works, and over 200 keynote speakings. Today,
That's
Dr.
an
Matt,
underwhelming body of work right there,
great, great.
My
Today,
God.
Dr. Matt, yeah, Dr. Matt has joined us to talk about psychoanalysis and how it is going to help the work in DAOs. So, yeah, welcome, Dr. Matt. How are you doing?
Namaste, bonjour, guten tag, wanakam, namaskar. Great to be with you in a global, transnational conversation about DAOs, which is a topic I think all three of us appreciate and
Brilliant.
enjoy, and look forward to discussing.
Absolutely, Matt. I mean, it was a pleasure kind of connecting with you over the R&R Discord. I must say, the more we connected and the more I kind of saw your history, I want to say that, the whole nature of this topic is something that I'm encountering. See, psychometrics is something I've kind of come across a couple of times, but to kind of have this as an implementation within a corporation, within a startup, I have not seen, I've not had the opportunity to kind of explore this in deep with the until I've come across, this conversation with you. And looking at the way DAOs currently function, DAOs have kind of been this, in terms of how it's been marketed, it's been seen as this utopia where coordination of capital, coordination of people across the globe is far more flexible than the existing trad structures out there. But in the midst of creating this new paradigm of work, the people are so kind of keen to experiment with work that they've kind of reinvented everything that we know about work. And with that, a lot of positives have come out of it, and with that, a lot of negatives have come out of it. And uh, one of which is the use of reputation systems to kind of understand who could be a right fit for your DAO in terms of governance, in terms of executing various contributor roles, etc. But then the main thesis of this topic is how your expertise with on human risk management and psychometrics should be a valuable addition to the in your words, and this is something controversial for the broader reputation people out there, very crude, could be achieved a lot better reputation systems out there. With that, we go forward with your I want to know more about how you kind of came to DAOs. What was your background like, and what connected you with DAOs and wanting to build a reputation system, and forwarding the frontiers of human risk management within DAOs.
Sure. So, I come at this because I'm an organizational psychologist. I've always studied people at work with scientific methods, but even in grad school, even in my dissertation, I did a lot with technology. So, from the very, very earliest days, I've been very interdisciplinary. So, even though I've done studies and all of my patents are all related to something about people at work. And some of that was at the bleeding edge pre-Web 1. That's how old I am. And over the years, even long before the internet, there have been disasters of organizations, and organizations are so important to our species. We're a tool making social species. Organizations are a special macro kind of tool for us to make our living, feed our kids, have a retirement and so forth. And yet so many organizations are destroyed or undermined by poor people practices or scumbags that cook the books. Back in the 80s, there were so many examples of companies that were just destroyed from half-assed human resource management, especially at senior leader levels. Um, some of you may know that famously, some of these people are brilliant at managing up and having a great brand that lasts longer than they're even alive. Like in India, where you guys are, most people think Mother Teresa was amazing, and yet most people don't know she misappropriated millions of dollars. If you ask anybody in Calcutta, they don't have nearly this kind of respect that other people do that don't know as much about her. She didn't give back money that was stolen from the Duvaliers in Haiti. So long before the internet, the problem of scumbags cooking the books or destroying others who are in an organization were problematic. And then there's the more day-to-day stuff that I normally focus on as an organizational psychologist. How do you hire people that can do a good job? How do you grow them? How do you manage their performance in a way that's fair and accurate and pay them correctly and create the organizational culture and climate? That's the more day-to-day stuff that's not so sexy, but it's just ordinary sources of variation in the company that can affect whether the company achieves its goals. So what's exciting for me about DAOs is the idea that a lot of the things that are opportunities for people with tremendous skills that don't have an opportunity, they don't have the credentials, they don't have the fancy degree. It doesn't really matter if you don't have the degree, if you can do the work. And so we usually use degrees, we use heuristics like so many projects done as a way to simplify our understanding of whether somebody can do the work or whether they're doing a good job. And we know in the science around performance management, for example, most of the managerial ratings of job performance are terrible. Sometimes in DAOs, these are called attestations, but they're generally super biased. And everybody can relate to this. Like when you think about how I might give somebody a test before I hire them, or if, to see if they've got good cognitive ability, if their personality's matched with it. I might structure my interview to hopefully predict whether they could do a good job. That's relevant to regular DAO or non-traditional or a traditional organization. So some of that is objective. Some of it is all of it's hard to measure, and all of it matters in terms of the probability a person does a good job. The same idea with the team matters, but to measure that performance is historically very, very tricky. It's a pain. A lot of companies, multinationals, have stopped doing it in a meaningful way because a lot of the feedback, it was more about the logistics and the bureaucracy of HR than it was about really measuring people and giving them feedback and helping them get better. DAOs has an opportunity to overcome a lot of the garbage from the past organizations. I'm excited about taking that to another level so that a lot of this is on chain and not a big pain in the neck. Who likes to take tests? Who likes clicking forms to do attestations or performance reviews? None of those are very fun. Many of them are not useful unless it's focused on something relevant to the DAO. So from my perspective, we got to think of DAOs as a special kind of new organization that exists for purposes. It's got a certain set of goals. What are those goals? And the folks that create that DAO or run that DAO, they have some ways to gauge whether that mission and vision is being realized. Are the financial and customer goals being met? Or maybe philanthropic, if it's a Klima DAO, for example, if it's some kind of charity type DAO. But there's a lot of stuff inside the DAO that has to happen to make that future a practical reality. And there are requirements that cascade throughout it. Some of those are done by people and teams. How do we use all the values of crypto, immutability, transparency, composability, but with meaningful information so we can make sure we manage those human resources well? We can avoid some of the problems of traditional organizations. This is why I'm excited about it. If that makes sense.
You mentioned that the sort of approach that you've talked about of blending these qualitative assessments with those standardized work assessments as well. Uh, Adding psychometrics and doing that qualitative assessments never really went well in these traditional organizations because of bureaucracy. And you mentioned that DAOs have this potential to kind of apply that in a much more standardized way than uh, it's kind of an opportunity to reshape that paradigm as we see it. But then you take a look at DAOs right now. I mean, they are a far different ball game compared to like a corporate organization. But then the thing is, while they've kind of while they're a different paradigm altogether, they're looking to revamp the wheel. Okay, what started off to the extent that, Matt, if in the early days of the DAO movement, you didn't have to even show a resume to start getting contributed. And disclosure, this is for non-dev roles, definitely when it comes to very important roles, like there would be some standard checks. But across DAOs, you wouldn't see this sort of checks being done until the shit hit the fan. It's when the bear market came in, when things really started changing. So you see a kind of a non-professionalism, a standard HR practice within these DAOs. So my curiosity is, where do you see the opportunity to apply your approach of psychometrics and human risk management when
Sure.
everything is sitting down at level zero? You've worked with corporations, when they have evolved past all these problems, and they're sitting with hundreds of people. But now you're having this approach with DAOs where they're not scaled yet. You're talking about early stage communities with their own set of problems. And
Right.
how do you see the application of human risk management to be suitable for DAOs at this stage? And
Sure.
why do you think that DAOs at this stage are capable of bringing that paradigm?
Great questions. Let me start at it from a slightly different camera angle with traditional ways of thinking about where psychometrics did or didn't work. I mean, absolutely, psychometrics have worked for years, longer than I've been alive, since World War I and II, to deal with human sources of risk in traditional organizations. My field was created to do that in World War I and II. That's where organizational psychology came from. It's just that only big multinationals could afford geeks like me, and very few of us are on planet Earth. The geeky scientist types, there's only maybe 10 or 15,000 people like me in the world that are specialists in this, and even fewer of us that are techno geeks that are also fond of crypto. And so I don't think I agree with you that there are differences in DAOs than in traditional organizations that we need to respect. But frankly, most of those are exciting and overcome a lot of the garbage I had to face when I was in multinationals in the past. Why now? And well, let me give you concrete examples. Would you both agree that even though Satoshi's original vision for Bitcoin, long before Vitalik and smart contracts, long before DAOs were even a glimmer of hope, people were thinking, wouldn't it be cool if we got Bitcoin adoption? This is before
Yeah,
2017 and the block size wars. How many places in Bangalore actually accept Bitcoin Cash or BTC today
none
or
of
ETH?
them. None of them,
Almost
because
none, right?
because the government made it a mandate that you cannot use anything but rupee as
Well,
a exchange of barter.
lately, but even before that law, I lived in India before that law. I tried in 2010. I couldn't find anywhere, even in Bangalore, to buy Bitcoin. I got my earliest Bitcoin in Mysore from the Bitcoin faucets, right? But even today, even outside of India, I mean, many Indians, as you know, leave India to spend Bitcoin, but even there, you have almost no adoption of the core value proposition of the original idea of peer-to-peer electronic cash before we even talk about DAOs, right? And what is it? There's a huge amount of science in traditional organizations and relevant to DAOs and Bitcoin around persuasion. We know uh, Professor Robert Cialdini is the world's foremost expert. He's a professor at Arizona State. His company is called Influence at Work, and I've been helping him reframe his company called the Cialdini Institute. There are many ways to ethically persuade people to say yes to request. Some of those things are about relationship cultivation, which I think in a DAO is much trickier than when you can meet people in real life. I mean, a lot of times they're anonymous, right? But there's three of Cialdini's factors that help cultivate relationships, two that reduce uncertainty, and two that motivate action. Whether it's influencing people to join your DAO, whether it's investors, whether it's customers. There's so many places where persuasion is important, not just crypto adoption with respect to DAOs. And yet, how many DAOs have folded because they couldn't get user adoption, or they couldn't get funding, or they couldn't convince member communities, right, to grow to a level of having enough people in the DAO to actually work. So if a founder of a DAO really wants to make their vision a reality, it's not purely a technical concern about whether they can make immutable smart contracts like Uniswap, right? It's going to have to also be about influencing that community, influencing investors, influencing maybe employees, if you want to call them that, or at least community members, however you want to label the folks working inside your DAO. um, to to embrace the idea. And there's a lot we know about measuring that and teaching it. Reputation is a good way over time to measure persuasion, but early in the DAO's life, how do you know if anybody has those skills? Or maybe you don't have a reputation. Maybe it's the first company you've ever founded as a DAO, and you don't have any reputation for anybody to rate you, or they might rate you, but they don't know you well enough. Well, in that case, a reputation is not a good way to measure it. There's actually a test I helped Professor Cialdini create, a situational judgment test. It's computer adaptive, gives you scenarios. Do you know how to apply the science correctly? So these are examples that are very squishy, right? It's very much a leadership dimension, but it's related. If you don't have that, you can't raise crypto, you can't hire Solidity programmers, you can't pay community managers if you don't have persuasion. So it's one of several ways where if you say, here's the DAO, here's what it's going to take, there's certain work requirements at the leadership levels, at the technical levels, at the tokenomic levels. What are the requirements? Are people able to perform to those levels? And there's different ways these assessments can help you understand where you've got gaps between where you need that work and where it's likely to be, or where it is ongoing. So there's a between the ears measurement component, there's a job performance or a team performance component, ultimately that add up to the ultimate goal, mission, and vision. That's how I'm approaching it, if that makes sense.
So, what you advocate is that this aspect of, the way reputation systems work now, it's mostly based on credentialing of past work done, but there's not a
Or
lot of
activity, or
exactly.
current activity. Like, activity might be, I could be super busy on Discord, I could be really active on Twitter. Is that productive? Did it help move the needle on whatever my work was and whatever roles in the DAO I'm playing? That's what really matters, not how, if I have no activity, that can't be any good. But just because I've got activity doesn't mean that's helpful to achieving the projects in the DAO or the teams that I'm on achieving their goals. And that's where we need to get to. It can't be mere activity information is necessary. It's just not sufficient. So I'm not saying that current reputation measures are complete garbage. They're just not yet measures. Measurements have a specific meaning in science. And the only approach in all of social science that is worth talking about is the only one that metrologists, engineers that specialize in physics, chemistry, biology, that they use too. And it's called Roche measurement. This is why in Discord, my name is Rosh on there, because I'm fond of this family of methods that take social science data and make it engineering worthy. And you need that in a DAO so that it can be truly trustworthy, where you're transparent about how much uncertainty. All measurements have error in them. None of them are perfect. Even our thermometers and rulers aren't perfect. But you want them to be usefully informative. And can you trust it? Well, one indicator of reputation isn't good enough, because I might be awesome at programming and I suck at keeping my word and I always deliver code too late. Or I'm extremely persuasive, but I know nothing about Solidity, right? So my reputation, it depends on what facet of my reputation we're talking about that might be relevant to a decision in a DAO. And so as I think about my DAO and where it's going and what roles are required, I need to be careful about what I'm articulating as work is required, what performance looks like, and making sure I'm using measurements that I can trust. Now, ideally, and the new AI kinds of assessments I work with, you don't need pain in the ass questions. You can actually take that activity we've been talking about, whether it's on Discord or Twitter, and actually measure things like personality objectively, just from their activity. But it takes a bunch of heavy lifting on certain AI algorithms to make sure that stuff is meaningful, that it's useful, because it's in a context of what the DAO needs from the person or the team.
So, what I want to understand is that this aspect, just reiterating, the whole reputation system is just a rehash of, past activity of various platforms, including your main work and probably your GitHub, but it doesn't have the qualitative assessments revolving around how the work was done. That's kind of crucial to kind of having the proper fit. But the thing with why this whole reputation system was evolved within a DAO is because they wanted something that was necessary to fit a pseudonymous contributor, like
Right.
a pseudonym. The DAO ecosystem is probably just 2 years old. Probably the reputation tools that have come out of it is probably a year. older or something like that. And we are basing the history of the way the teams right now work is they look at the history of the crypto contributors to an extent of the work that's done in crypto.
Right.
And the entire history before that, I mean, now it's becoming much more stricter. And of course, there are checks across, but not completely. Otherwise, we wouldn't have seen the situation that occurred with Wonderland when that CFO of Quadrica CX turned out to be Sifu,
Right.
who was managing the treasury. And you
Right.
may see a lot of those examples across many DAOs. But
Right.
that's the point. I mean, DAOs have a certain way of functioning. That is, they want to be inclusive to people who are, you know, pseudonymous. They have a higher degree of trust than the general corporate world or the HR world. You know, Web3 in general is much more trusting. That's why, you know, people from different backgrounds are very easily included. But that just increases the risk of, that particular actor being subverted or being a subverted person in general. But my question is, this is how the reputation systems have evolved based on what the DAOs have functioned, and based on that work, the reputation systems have evolved. There's not been a lot of study on how things have done in the corporate world because they feel that they are a new. I mean, they feel that the way they do things is completely different. Now, what I want to understand from you, Matt, is that what you're advocating is an approach that's very comprehensive, requires a lot of signaling from people who have worked with these people before. And that requires an intense amount of, besides the AI personality test that you mentioned, across work, if aspects like conscientiousness, at least according to my understanding, requires some signals from your teams. But
No,
how do you?
not necessarily.
All right. So what?
Let me clarify. First of all, let me disabuse. Every industry I've worked in thinks it's totally different, as if it's Homo sapiens are completely different than every other, whether I'm talking pharma or when I ran Six Sigma at Motorola or at Infosys. Every company, every industry thinks nothing about anyone else is ever the same. So I am not arguing with you that Web3 has differences. It does. But are they so materially different that nothing from prior organizational science is relevant? No, no. It's just more about what are the nuances. So to your point, I think you're making an extremely important point, Abhishek. So let me clarify. Before I know anything about the person, maybe I can't get reputation yet, right? When they're brand new DAO member, they've never been in Web3 before, they don't have a reputation yet. Right? They've barely been on Discord, or maybe they have so little activity in Twitter and Discord that I have no reputation yet. In those cases, traditional psychology would say you don't start with reputation when you don't have one yet. You start with other self-report measures, which aren't necessarily as good. The reputational approaches to measuring conscientiousness are about 2 to 3 times more valid in predicting workplace behavior than self-report. That doesn't mean self-report is worthless. It's better than having no information. But notice I'm talking specifically about conscientiousness, which is the probability somebody's going to keep their word, they pay attention to details. When I worked at Infosys, Narayana Murthy is famous in India for being squeaky clean. The guy never takes a bribe. He's extremely conscientious, one of the most conscientious people I've ever measured, and this won't be surprising to the Indian listeners. He has a reputation, but imagine him in the 80s when he was getting the $200 loan from his wife to start Infosys, where nobody would give him money because nobody knew that's who he was. A self-report, he would have been humble enough. So there are other measures too in India too. You know that intelligence tests, cognitive ability tests, like that is not a good thing to measure on reputation. It's better to give them an actual test. And there's computer adaptive ones where people can't fake it. And even if they try and copy all the questions, it won't matter because the computer can have completely different questions. So in the life cycle of a DAO, early with the earliest prospective members, or frankly in due diligence, right? How many DAOs are frustrated? They've financially been successful. They want to give grants. How do they know who's going to do right by it or not? Right? If they've got no reputation, or they have a reputation, but it's not related to what their project is. Well, these tests and self-reports are one way to do it that are sometimes better than reputation. But even if we stay with reputation for a second, my issue with the industry right now is not that reputation's not important. It is. It's that it depends on what we're talking about. And the people making the ratings and reputation are usually 2 to 3 times super biased about severity and leniency, more than the kind of diversity variables that I also care about. But the effects from bias on diversity stuff, like cross-cultural bias or stuff like that, are usually very much smaller than the fact that some people are tough raters and some are lenient. And when you got a reputation measure, even if it's just measuring one thing like it needs to, like conscientiousness, you still got all that problem. And the problem is, most of those, I've not seen a single DAO reputation measure that actually articulates what the hell it is that they're measuring. Is it job performance? Is it conscientiousness? Is it charisma? Is it persuasion? There's like 100 things I could think of that's a totally different indicator. Murthy might have been a genius at charisma. He was incredibly inspiring when I was there and super conscientious, but he's no longer an awesome programmer, certainly not on Web3 technologies the way he was maybe in the late 80s, right? Because he's just not done that for decades. So like, it's silly to think that we shouldn't have an array, depending on the use case, depending on what the DAO needs, we should measure those things on chain. And, as the conscientious person self-reports, if they're not keeping their word, they're not delivering code, they're not finishing the project on time, or they're burning too many resources, these are the times to get the community to rate only that conscientiousness, or better than the rating and the attestation, the AI can do it unobtrusively. So conscientious people are more likely to not send willy-nilly, misspelled words in the Discord, for example, right? So that there's new AI systems that can do this unobtrusively on chain, that if it becomes a standard, well, now you've got history. So when the DAO that's giving a grant wants to know if they can trust the founders of a new DAO, or the project should get funded with crypto, well, you've got some kind of history on chain that's transparent about what the team delivered in the past. And I'm suggesting 4 camera angles to this, whether it's at the team, project, process, or person level, in terms of performance and that history. The quality, the cost, the quantity or volumes, and cycle time. These are 4 camera angles that are very different in terms of reputation, right? Quality would be fitness for use, the classic engineering definition, or customer delight. Cost is, I might deliver awesome code, or I delight the customer. Do I burn too many resources, more than I promised when I pitched my proposal in the DAO? So quality, cost, quantity, does it scale? How many of you use ChatGPT in Web 2 and it shuts you out because it can't handle the scale, right? Is the project scalable? Is the code scalable? Is the full amount of the product or service of the DAO the full distance that was promised and that the market needed? And then cycle time, speed. You could see where reputation in a team or a person in a DAO might be a little different depending on which one of those 4 we're looking at. Might have awesome quality and awesome speed, and you can scale, but you burned way more capital, or you ran out of cash, you ran out of capital to even fund your project. So I'm proposing a new way to think about organizational design in a DAO that starts with mission and vision and the ultimate metrics that they track there, and uses these frames so that the human sources of risk in a DAO are managed, sophisticated. So the measurement's only part of it. The other part's what levers can a DAO community pull to make all that stuff better? Well, they don't know what levers to pull if they don't have good information about where the gaps are, where the bottlenecks are. So what I'm offering is a way to think about the constraints in the DAO, the bottlenecks, responsibly with trustworthy information.
But then again, you kind of mentioned that I agree that across the board, there has to be a holistic way of seeing how a person is picked besides just the job performance. And the way reputation is kind of seen is very hazy. It doesn't give a broader conclusion of a person. I mean, Discord activity or discourse activity doesn't really give you a qualitative insight about a person. But then what I want to understand is that this is your insight from your experience with these industries. And DAOs in general have not really, I'm seeing from the perspective of, the people who handle HR within DAOs, they don't have that reference point like you.
Correct.
They don't have the experience to assess, or they don't even have the processes like you.
Sure.
What I want to understand here is that when you're talking about DAOs, that let's be frank, DAOs are nascent, it's great, but probably 80% of DAOs don't have the resources. They don't have the time. They don't have uh, the the sort of background to be able to sit and give you the information that's kind of valid for this thing to go through.
Sure.
In such an environment, my question is, what is the reference that DAOs should look at
Yeah.
to accept that yes, this is a better destination in terms of progress? I mean,
Sure.
like for example, the way DAO hiring goes, probably uh, it's very inefficient in picking people because they leave too quickly or they turn out to be in terms of governance they maybe get subverted quickly. But what is the uh, what has been achieved in corporate organizations with the approach that you're talking about, that DAOs should consider that yes, this is the way to go?
Sure. Well, let me. I think you're a little too hard on Dow HR people. Let me just make sure you're aware that in all the multinationals, long before crypto, long before DAOs were a thing, none of the HR, very very few HR organizations on planet Earth do this well either, right? And it's largely because people like the true experts are typically academics who don't have care about entrepreneurship and keep their ideas about this locked in peer-reviewed vaults. However, a few multinationals like Procter and Gamble or IBM have historically, for decades before crypto, shown that you can predict job performance with this kind of psychometric type stuff and massively reduce the chance that somebody fails at their job. And that there's literally 100 years of science around this. Within DAOs, I would say it's not the DAO members per se that I'm appealing to, at least right now. What I'm suggesting is the founders have a mission and vision. If they wanted a reality, look at what's happened in Cosmos and Ethereum in recent history, right? In the early days, even Vitalik couldn't keep, Polkadot spun out. So many Cosmos has been a complicated mess. There's a lot about persuasion and leadership that was missing, or the blockchain wars, right? And some would argue both Bitcoin Cash and BTC Bitcoin both failed as a result of the block size wars. And some of that, not all of it, but some of it was from a failure of persuasion. So what I'm not arguing with you at all, Abhishek, that HR people are busy, but just like the ones I'm used to working with in big companies, they generally miss the forest for the trees. They're generally like logistics people and legal, like an extension of the legal department, not focused on the ultimate mission and vision, which is where the founders are. I'm offering to you that where I'm suggesting, and I was thrilled last week, I gave a presentation on this through RNDAO, and I had somebody from Cosmos interested. So I'm talking to them about where are the weak links. Right now, Cosmos is in a bit of a pickle because they had their latest proposal for upgrades rejected. And it's a mess because it's a complicated ecosystem of multiple DAOs, and they kind of want to be the multi-blockchain paradigm, right? Very complicated to influence. However, there are some weak links and there's some risks around their proof of stake and validators and governance all being too mixed together. So my thing is, what I've just described to you both in this podcast is a bit like boiling the ocean, just to give you a flavor for what I'm thinking. But I'm not saying we should start there because this doesn't exist in a meaningful way on chain yet. Let's start with very wicked, painful problems that Cosmos, for example, or Ethereum or Polygon, the layer twos, that those DAOs are really losing sleep over. And let's only talk about the biggest gaps at the ultimate DAO level between where you want the DAO to be and where it is. And why is that the case? What part of your processes or your projects are the most risky? How much of that is from people? That's where I'm chasing it. So it's very practical of saying what part of your DAO's goals are at risk and there's too many bottlenecks that if I don't get the people part right. Now, when I talked to the Cosmos people last week, it sure sounded like the community folks aren't sure how to attract people to go do the work so they have a de-risking. And they certainly don't know how to influence the complicated multi-stakeholder thing and some of the ugly history of Cosmos in a better place. Well, whether it's a leadership thing or it's something more technical, like both are good candidates to start with, well, what is the requirement? What's the work that's not getting done right? But starting with how many ATOM, how many ETH are being bled because you don't have this right, and what part of that. If it's only 10%, if it's 30% of people, fine. Well, now you know how to size the investment. And let's be transparent about not doing everything for every DAO, but just specifically the jobs that are causing that pain in the DAO. That's how I'm approaching it, so that it's practical. And the bigger vision can come later, but I don't think there's any reason to think, first of all, it's using the same orientation blockchain people already have around immutability and composability and transparency, but algorithms that are truly trustworthy, where we know why the damn thing works. And it's not just some gross reputation. It's, well, if I need to screen people who are smart and who can pass a test because I don't have a reputation, and they can pass a solidity test and they're conscientious, all right, and then that's one way to do it. Or if it's more of a leadership thing, we know how to screen if they're persuasive already, and if they're not, we know how to teach and grow that and de-risk it, because it's too friggin' hard. I mean, we're talking a multi-trillion-dollar industry now, and if we can't influence some of this to change, it's not going to make the full vision happen. And we know something about persuasion. So you could see where my current conversations with them is, well, you tell me where are your biggest gaps? Where is it in your DAO that's causing it? And where are the people not able to do whatever you need them to do? And then let's back into where the psychometrics can be part of the problem, because detecting the risk isn't good enough. It's just a start. You also got to pull levers to make that all better. But you got to start with, see, in the current reputation, you have no idea why the variation is the way it is. It because it's because they've got about a bunch of biased people? Is it because their quality's awesome and they're assholes? What is it? Why is the reputation good or bad? You don't really know. And then you know what levers to pull. We know why the psychology works. We just want to focus it on pain points that people that run DAOs are really worried about. And I think that's what's very, very different about my approach than your typical HR people who have no clue what they don't have a way to think about translating mission, vision, strategy, and ultimate goals into processes, projects, and people. And that's what I'm trying to do.
The funny thing is, you mentioned that. No, I agree that we have to see this holistically, in tune with the gaps that's there in DAOs, and how much of that gap is caused by human risk that should be kind of eliminated by having the right assessment system that you're kind of talking about, while assessing those key psychometrics that you mentioned, like conscientiousness, those qualities actually. But what I want to understand here is, as you mentioned, the on-chain aspect is not the problem. Okay, I feel that okay, the data is not the issue here. I feel that the main issue is the same thing that's kind of pervading across even the corporate world that you mentioned. HR people don't know how to say it. If that's a problem in corporate world, then definitely in the corporate world with HR, you have at least a science that they're kind of going through. They refer to things. But in the DAO world, it's everything is starting from scratch. There is no reference point. So how do the people who kind of have to pick people and who have to see these things through your lens, how are they what is the reference point for them that they should like, say for example, if I want to pick somebody through governance, I'd see their discourse forum, I take a look at their background, I see probably what all proposals they've done, and on the basis of that I probably take a call on and vote whether this person is a good delegate or not. There is no psychometrics scores that I can see, and
Right.
even if I did, the way you measure psychometrics and on-chain activity is going to be very different for for each role that comes into play, be it
Right.
governance, be it operations, or be it
That's right.
contributor level roles. How My question is, one, how are you going to assess these qualities across roles, and number two, how are these DAO people supposed to create the evaluation system through your approach?
Sure. And let me give you a couple of Web 2 examples that are really compelling, right? You asked this, and I wasn't trying to evade it before, but Amazon, Google have done excellent work. Amazon, other than the federal government, is the largest employer of people in my field. And you can imagine they're very sophisticated and they've got it in all kinds of ways. Well, the way to do it is to say, all right, well, what are the job families? program Solidity or Rust programmer. Rust is different than Solidity, but the personality and cognitive ability attributes would be the same. It's just the knowledge and skill that would be a little different, right? And those are both different than, say, community manager, right? So what are the job requirements for literally 100 years? The US government has something that used to be called the Dictionary of Occupational Titles. It's now called ONET. It's free, it's open source. It basically defines what the science is about generalized work behaviors across all jobs in every industry. And then what's the stuff, that's the work, the actual tasks that you do. Then there's stuff between your ears, the personality, the ability, the knowledge, the skills. These are taxonomies, just like you think of in biology, of, well, what is it? What are the attributes that I might want to go measure? And some really are completely inappropriate for reputation at all. For example, even your wife or husband may not know what you're passionate about in terms of day-to-day work. Maybe your best friend, right? But almost nobody could rate how passionate you are. And that matters to a DAO, right? You want people really passionate. So you kind of got to ask the member what they love to do. And just because they're a great programmer doesn't mean they want to go do that for your DAO. So what I'm suggesting to you is it starts with the ultimate DAO goals and saying, to get the full distance, what are all the job families? What are those job requirements, the actual tasks they have to go do? And that those behaviors, the activity that's required, then suggests, well, what stuff between their ears, their knowledge, their skills, their abilities, their traits that are required. And then that you can see where this starts to give me the kind of blueprint for what psychometrics might be required and how best to measure them. Some of them are in tests, some of them are in self-reports, some of them are reputations. And you can see where it gets complicated quickly. But if you start only with where are the weak links in your existing DAO and the bigger DAOs that might fund this, who are struggling because they got scale, they got volumes, but this is messy. It's kind of a way. The example, Abhishek, you just gave is kind of a waste of a manager's time if the person has no probability of doing a good job. Even if they've got Solidity on the resume, can they write good code? Is it relatively bug free? Like an actual good test would actually be a big work relief from a manager who's got a lot of noise, and we could give them much more signal, or at least get you 3 candidates that are smart and they pass the Solidity test, and you're gonna interview them for something else that maybe there isn't an existing on-chain assessment for. Like it's really a waste of people's time to screen for these things when the algorithms, frankly, there's huge amount of science that say these algorithms do a better job than humans, even throughout psychology, but only if they're built and engineered the way I'm describing it, right? So that's at the person level. What I think is equally importantly is that same manager might have a team of people in the DAO, whether they're on the community side, they're on the engineering side, they're on tokenomics, regardless of what it is, there's some process to that team. And the team's got targets that fit within a bigger picture of the ultimate DAO. Well, those targets, I would suggest you want to track those too. So, the project management, process management stuff ultimately hit, is the team producing what it's supposed to produce? Burning the right amount of crypto that it's supposed to in the speed and at the volumes it's supposed to. That's the quality, cost, quantity, cycle time, QC that I recommend thinking about. You could see that down at the team level. Now their reputation might be a little different, right? The team members might know, if I'm noisy on Discord, but I'm not very productive, right? I'm not a good team member. I'm not a good organizational citizen. So when it comes to job performance, it's not just, do I write good code? Am I doing my community behaviors well? It's also, ultimately, does that add up to the collective team that I'm on? Do other people see me as effective? And you can see where coordinate, there's plenty of compensation approaches that have a piece of this. They just may not do it as holistically, and make sure that that's combined with, that's likely to go well because you've already got upstream psychometrics detecting human risk. And ultimately at the ultimate DAO governance level, you want to say, are all of my processes, all my teams at or above where they need to be to get my ultimate vision? And if not, the weak link breaks the chain. I want to focus my governance, resources on where the bottlenecks are. That's kind of the vision I'm promoting.
What I want to understand at this point is, I see that across the DAO system in general, why I feel that this approach could make sense more than the corporate world is because of how dynamic and how the pseudonymity provides that factor where you need that data assessment given out in some sort of a profile, which makes it easier for people to kind of pick the right people. But what I want to understand is the main one of the many factors that I see. I kind of read about psychometrics in general. You see that being applied in major corporations in general. But the reason why I didn't pick up in startups and in the broader aspect is one, there's this apprehension that when you're having these candidates in front of you, the past is not really a guarantee for how you perform in the future.
Agree. Agree.
And the way the entire profile looks right now with this aspect relies heavily on that assessment of the past. And the way DAOs are kind of functioning right now, you take a look at the scenario now. I am not being, I mean, so far through the conversation, this is not being me being pessimistic in general about the DAO situation. This is me talking about the situation of DAOs in the bear market today and being relevant to those points. So
Sure.
DAOs in general currently do they have a different situation compared to a corporate world. They don't have 10,000 candidates banging at their door for a certain role or governance.
Right. Right.
Most of them are hunting for people to kind of come in and support them. And
Yep.
that is across the board. So how do you kind of alleviate this concern that you can be able to predict the future of a person acting through a psychometric profile, and number two, the feasibility of this exhaustive assessment in the face of DAOs having to fight for human resources at this point of time.
Sure. Sure. No, and all good points. Let me just back up and also give my answer partially from the point of view of the member, right? So far, I've been really DAO centric, but I also care about the members as a psychologist. And part of my vision is, historically, psychometrics have been used by the big company, and the person never got squat in terms of feedback. They have no idea why they didn't get the job, or how they did on the test or whatever. Obviously, on chain with multi-sig wallets, that can change. So, if we just stay with the point you made a moment ago, Abhishek, let's assume you're right that most DAOs are struggling to recruit members, right? It's not the same as a traditional employment thing. Well, that too is a human process. And we know a ton about persuasion, like I said. And it's not just the Cialdini stuff, it's also inspiring people. So a friend of mine who's John Antonakis is the world's expert on charisma. And I've taught and coached, and a lot of my AI is about measuring and improving people's charisma. So I don't want your listeners to be left thinking psychometrics is only for pre-employment. No, it's also for development. And if it's Cosmos or it's some new DAO that's truly exciting, truly compelling, you might need your founders to grow their ability to inspire people to want to knock on the door of the DAO to join. And so inspiration and the whole charisma is a special case in what Cialdini would call reciprocity in leadership. So it's easy to talk the moral purpose. If you're Klima DAO and you're talking about the environment, or you're talking about, RNDAO and talking about minimum viable salary, right? There's a lot of exciting things for a lot of people about these things. So talking about the moral purpose is a much easier thing to do than to use metaphors, use nonverbal behaviors, talk in colorful stories, you modulate your voice. These are things that we know inspire people, that if as decentralized as DAOs are, if that's really important and that's the bottleneck to the ultimate DAO vision, well then don't think of psychometrics only in screening DAO members who can be persuasive and charismatic, but growing it, right? Psychometrics is just measurement of people. It doesn't have to just be screening. And so again, back to, I don't want to pretend like you should put psychometrics into absolutely everything for its own sake, but where are the pain points right now? In Cosmos, it appears that this multi-chain and ugly history of Cosmos means there's a need to inspire people. They just rejected their new upgrade vision, which, in Ethereum doesn't have this problem, it looks like. So they have to inspire people. Well, what is it about Tendermint? Now, the Polygon guys using Tendermint, they have an exciting story to tell about how that's part of the multi-chain future integrated with Ethereum, right? But it takes special skill, and ideally, it's not one person. Let me give you a concrete example. Before I moved to India and Infosys, I looked after Sutter Health, which is a not-for-profit, and part of my job was to persuade or help my parent company CEO persuade 82 fiduciary boards to dissolve themselves. Would you agree that's a brutally tough problem? Convince a fiduciary board to dissolve itself, let alone dozens and dozens? Hard, right?
Damn tough.
And it's not like one exciting speech is going to do this. It's not like one persuasive appeal would do it. It took a lot of coaching and training. I brought in Cialdini, and I coached these senior leaders for years, and they're down to one fiduciary. But you can imagine how hard that was. Or in India, at Infosys, I helped land a $1 billion deal with Harley Davidson. Well, it wasn't. Large company deals are never one buyer. It's usually multiple teams of buyers. It's similarly more decentralized and opaque in a DAO, but it's a similar approach that a very complicated DAO situation like the DAOs associated with Cosmos, it's going to take multi-stakeholders in an exciting way to convince the community that's even there, that they're already part of the DAO, to change. And psychometrics can be part of is my team of leaders or core members sufficiently exciting and persuasive or not? Or do I need to go get them better? And then let me remeasure, are they working hard enough before they're even better? If they're not working at it, they're not trying to get better, they're not going to. And we know whether it's learning a foreign language or it's writing code or being a leader, you got to practice this stuff. So you could see where what I'm offering is transparency, just like we think of crypto transparency between detecting human risk, the early warning signs that the risk is going to be mitigated if it's exciting people to join your DAO would be, am I practicing enough and am I getting better over time to a level that when I get remeasured, now I'm better and better. The AI psychometrics can do this stuff automatically, like every Discord, every YouTube, every Riverside presentation I do. Am I getting better and better? Or am I at least above the standard the DAO needs me to be to get enough people to join the DAO, to influence the next generation of the DAO's vision for the next blockchain? So is this answering your question?
Matt, I just wanted to kind of ask you about the Cosmos situation, because there happens to be some listeners will be tuning in and they might not be aware of it. And you mentioned it a couple of times. Clarity's sake, can you just give us an understanding of what exactly happened with Cosmos?
Okay, I will do my very sincere best, and I apologize in advance to the Deep Cosmos people if I misunderstood anything about it. My understanding is the early founders, there was a rift early in Cosmos, and it split into multiple chains. There's attempts at integrating a multi-chain vision, and obviously they have a lot less traction than the Ethereum ecosystem, although it's integrated, right? Because of Tendermint and Polygon. And just recently I understood that there was a V1.2 proposal that got rejected, that they couldn't agree on a shared vision for the future. So this is a coordination problem that we're hoping DAOs to overcome, but it's going to take both technical skill, instrumental leadership around, well, what should that be? What makes sense? What makes Cosmos exciting or complementary or better than Ethereum or Phantom, or pick your favorite alternative blockchain ecosystem? And then convince other well-wishers who are also part of maybe not necessarily competing DAOs, but DAOs that are a little different than your own DAO. You can see where there's a technical component that's tricky to this. There's a leadership component that's tricky to this. And the leadership components are not purely inspiration. They're not purely persuasion. There's a technical component, but that is not likely to be, it looks like it's failed 3 times, the most recent version of this, when I've looked at their documents. So I apologize in advance for Cosmos if I misunderstood any of that. My broader point is it's normal in human communication, even pre-crypto. And that's the point of leadership, is to ethically move people in a direction that floats everybody's boats, that's better for everyone. And it's just one of many things. Like, I might be awesome as a leader on that, but I'm lousy on something else, on tokenomics or something, and hence the need for a multidisciplinary team. And all of that, for example, is why traditional multinationals have lawyers and finance and HR and strategy, all at the board level, because no mere mortal knows it all. And so the plea I'm making is, think about what your DAO is about, how to de-risk it. Those have requirements. And we know in psychology how to define those, and we know how to predict what those will be. Don't think of it only in selection or in decision-making for investment. Think of it too in development, and to mitigate, because on an ongoing basis, what if this isn't the last transformational change in crypto? Probably not, right? It's just too new of a space. You probably need transformational leaders in the future too. Well, and are you growing the next generation because somebody gets hit by a bus, um, or they retire, or they move out of the ecosystem? Well, then you need to sustain it. So you could see where this is part of sustaining the legacy is growing others to do that work, whether it's technical or social or leadership.
I appreciate Abhishek for kind of bringing the example of Cosmo, because I know that we probably have to close the convo, but this is a very you know big question that I wanted to ask. And your example of that health company as well as that Cosmo situation kind of highlights one very important thing, that why the Cosmos situation failed is because I don't know the situation, but what I can suss from it is probably a lack of quorum and a problem of incentive design. You know, the way I mean, it was an apt example. It just kind of mirrored the Cosmos situation very well. That why would the fiduciary board want to dissolve itself and make itself meaningless? So that was not a. I mean, that is a human risk caused by a incentive problem at the organizational design. The
Partially,
incentives are absolutely
partially,
so.
partially, not completely though, right? Because there's skin in the game. There's pride. I'm part of this, and if it's going to dissolve, is it part of my identity? So some of it's economic, some of it's personal.
Exactly. So my question is, how? I mean, how should people look at that? I mean, where is human risk caused by the person and human risk that is created because of a flawed incentive system going to come in place?
Yeah.
And yeah, that's the question I had in mind.
No, and for me, it all starts way up at the mission, vision, strategy, and ultimate objectives, right? Vitalik pointed out that a lot of the disasters of FTX had everything to do with half-assed. It's the opposite of what Satoshi was originally envisioning, right? There's nothing decentralized about Alameda or FTX. It was a terrible org design, even before we talk about incentives, and it was not transparent. He was cooking the books. It was so the opposite of everything crypto is supposed to be about, and DAOs, right? So for me, it starts with mission, vision. It can be economic incentives. It can be structural. It can also be human, because those things, you can have all the right incentives and decentralization. You can still have assholes that are pricks, that are awesome technically, and create a trail of dead bodies that turn off your members that don't want to be part of that, right? So it starts with mission, vision. What is it you're trying to accomplish together? What's the work required, both collectively in processes and projects, and then in individuals and job families? And if you started to define that in the places that are most painful, the most risky, then now you've got a way to build the psychometrics to be useful in mitigating those risks.
And with that, what I wanted to understand is that I understand that it's partial. Maybe if you kind of adhere to your mission, vision, and goals, then kind of creating that system would be far more simpler, and that design wouldn't be kind of conflicting with the human risk element itself. But the issue here is that even though you have these goals in place, it's with time the operation. See, it's great to have these theoretical mission, vision, and goals, but when it's coming into execution, a lot of things that isn't factored, about how people kind of operate in a system like that is not taken into account. And
No, I agree.
like for example, when Aave had a governance vote, two of their proposals didn't hit quorum, meaning they didn't even hit the voting threshold.
Right. Right.
That's is that an incentive problem? Probably because most token holders don't see the need to vote for a thing like that. Maybe there's no incentive for them to get the right decision. Is that a problem? Is that a
Yeah.
problem of the conscientiousness, or is that an incentive problem? How do
Or
reputation
persuasion.
thinkers think of that?
Or persuasion. So to your point, let me not. I don't want to over. I'm suggesting that whether it's Aave or another DAO, there's a cascade between mission, vision, ultimate strategic goals, and operations. I'm simply articulating that in Aave's case, did they do a good job having traceability between why that proposal was good, and then it's not merely incentives. I'm agreeing that's a piece of it, but did they get people excited about it? Did they persuade effectively? Did they build relationships? Like relationship cultivation, uncertainty reduction, and motivating action are Cialdini's model of persuasion. Those are not, these are deceptively simple things. It's easy for you to hear me say them. They're brutally hard in the context of all the complexity in a DAO to get right and use in a very elegant way as a chorus, as a variety of stakeholders in the DAO trying to convince people to innovate, to vote. So what I'm arguing is think of the org design where incentives are a piece, but so is uncertainty about how the operations are going. Whether it's a service DAO, it's a little different than if it's a product DAO, right? The targets for the products, the targets for the service, and how you measure the service is a little different in each. I'm saying there's a certain flow of value that happen in those things to create the mission and vision that frame what the work is. Some of it's at this leadership level you're asking me about with decisions. We know decision making somewhat of a cognitive task, right? And we know a lot about cognitive psychology, decision making. Some of it's persuasion, some of it's economic, and with the kind of infrastructure, with the cascade into operations and a definition of work, you now have a way to manage it. Like when I was in semiconductors or at Motorola with Six Sigma, statistical process control, and you see all these indicators, but you know how they're supposed to work, and you're asking the question, are they working that way or not? Because it's not just the people, it's people and the code, it's people and the software together that are creating the products or services. So what I'm offering is an organizational design intended to create certain outcomes that requires certain roles. And this is where the information, psychometric information, comes from, to help de-risk it all. But right now it's opaque. Nobody knows these things are not defined, and you don't know what work is supposed to happen before other work. You don't really know what behaviors are required. And these reputation measures that currently exist, who knows what part of that, if any, it's actually giving you signal, or is it all noise? It's hard to say today.
Absolutely. I mean, reputation systems today, in general, they're crude. We've not seen like mainstream adoption throughout the DAO, probably across probably delegates for certain tools like Karma. But then the sort of approach that you're talking about provides the potential of a holistic approach where it can be used for broader aspects like not just the hiring, but even as a way to improve a person through the life cycle of a person being involved within the DAO, to kind of
Right.
improve the retention in a way where he's able to get solid feedback
Right.
without without personal involvement per se.
Correct. And the feedback can be automated. So, I mean, when I left Infosys in India, I was frustrated that, I couldn't scale coaching below the C-suite at Infosys, right? And I was living in India where there's 1.3 billion wonderful Homo sapiens who could benefit, but there's no way I could have scaled that without AI. And so the company I created before, right after I left Infosys, was a way to do that. So you could see on chain, there are ways to use the psychometrics that benefit both the DAO and the member, right? And the member can get private information about what they could do, the things that they've mastered, the stuff that's too hard. And if it's on chain or it's bled out, it's API integrated with Discord and Twitter, you could see where something like persuasion or charisma that can be measured through language, they could get ongoing feedback. The DAO can get it at their level where they need it if it's job related, and the member can get it on chain or through their multi-sig wallet in a way that's developmental. So you can achieve multiple goals, but you can't do it if you don't know what work they're supposed to do and where their gap is, because there's only so many things they can grow at a time. So you can see that the psychometrics is kind of a digital quantitative backbone that can be used for lots of purpose to de-risk the DAO. And then there's something in it for the member in terms of their development too. And it doesn't all have to be humans, other DAO members giving him feedback. It can be AI if it's built right.
Absolutely. And I mean, the involvement of AI itself will be pretty fascinating to see. You kind of see AI kind of completing medical exams. Now we want to see it kind of give, as close an objective assessment of a person's, qualities along with the job performance as well. And that is something that with, on-chain protection of, I mean, access control of a member being involved, you can see some major paradigm shifts being happening. And with that, considering we are on time, I would like to close this convo for the sake of keeping your time as well. I enjoyed the convo, Matt. Don't I mean this is me getting into the conversation and asking these tough questions because this is something that I find really fascinating, and I see that it could really work. But then the way the ecosystem works, there's that gap that the DAO audience needs to understand to be able to fully embrace it. These
Sure.
gray areas must be talked about, and I enjoyed having a person with the sort of background that you've had, walk in to step in and try to solve this a major problem for the DAO ecosystem and take crypto forward as it is. Where can people find you, and how can the DAO audience support your initiative going forward?
Thank you for having me. Yeah, and thank you for the question. So I'm at Excellency on Twitter and excellency.co. I'm really eager to work with folks at RNDAO who were generous in letting me present last week. And I think they're about to upload that to, if you want more detail on that. That presentation was about the last book I wrote at Infosys called Leading Value Creation, that gets much more into technical detail on some of the things we talked about here. My email is matt@xlnc.co. I would love to find collaborators who are frankly better than me at tokenomics, at the marketing, at the coding. I'm deep in the science and I'm fond of the technical things, but I'm partnered up with Arendau to find colleagues, who want to work together on this sort of thing. I think the Talent DAO people are also good colleagues who are also with a similar background, similar orientation. But yeah, I'd love to find colleagues who want to work together on de-risking, making the future of DAOs a practical reality.
Absolutely. And with the sort of conversation that you've brought forward and the potential of this, I have no doubt that there will be collaborators who would want to step in and make this idea a true reality. With that, we close the convo. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening in. Stay tuned for the next one.